And I want you to know that we already have undergrads going to Africa and doing marvelous work, and we also have an amazing cadre of graduate students who have been engaged in working on Africa, who have been doing really path-breaking research on the continent. And one of them is here with us tonight, who is from Kenya, and who is a master's student in international studies, and who has been working on hip-hop music and urban culture among youth in Nairobi, Kenya. Her name is Aisha Yahya, and she will be presenting to you Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o. So please join me in welcoming to the podium Aisha Yahya.
In the summer of 2004, I returned to my hometown of Nairobi, Kenya, where the city was buzzing with one man's name. Kenyans of all backgrounds were preparing for the long-awaited homecoming of a national icon, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who was coming home after 22 years of self-imposed exile. His prominence as one of Kenya's and indeed Africa's and the world's most celebrated and influential novelists and playwrights was manifest as throngs gave him a hero's welcome at the airport. Hundreds more flocked to various venues where he had scheduled talks and lectures as part of his East African tour. On one August afternoon, I joined scores of students and community members in a very crowded Taifa Hall at Nairobi University to hear him lecture on the role of universities in contemporary African society. The air reverberated with electric anticipation as people filled every bit of space in the room. Being as short as I am, I could barely see the stage from my vantage point. But as he began to speak, I stopped trying to see him, because hearing him was enough. He expounded on how colonialism had dismembered local communities by forcefully devaluing local languages and cultural forms and imposing colonial values. He asked us to remember ourselves, to return to our roots, to actively promote our languages and give credence to our unique cultural identities within and outside academia. A powerful message for my generation, which has been taught to operate in English. As a young Kenyan who is always caught at the crux of competing values of so-called tradition and modernity, and who must constantly negotiate through an evolving cultural landscape in a post-colonial and globalizing world, his words resonated very strongly in my mind. Indeed, Ngugi's message as a scholar and post-colonialist theorist has resonated the world over, and he has left an indelible mark in the academic and literary world. His works, which include novels like Weep Not Child, The River Between, and A Grain of Wheat, have been translated in more than 30 different languages and tackle themes that highlight the far-reaching impact of colonization and neocolonialism. He has championed the use of indigenous languages in literature, deciding in 1977 to start using his native language of Gikuyu instead of English in his writing. His first Gikuyu novel published in 1980 was Devil on the Cross, which he started to write while in prison. He had been detained without a trial at the end of 1977 after the critical political message in the popular play I Will Marry When I Want, which he co-wrote, invoked the wrath of the Kenyan government. Before his detention, he was a professor at University of Nairobi, but was not reinstated after his release. While abroad in 1982 promoting his books, he learned of a government plan to arrest him again, and he chose not to return. Since that time, he has taught at Yale, Amherst College, and New York University, and been a visiting professor and guest lecturer at numerous other institutions. His contributions have been recognized through such distinguished awards as the Paul Robeson Award for Artistic Excellence, Political Conscience, and Integrity, the UNESCO First Prize, and the Nonino International Prize. He is currently a distinguished professor of English and Comparative Literature and the director of the International Center for Writing and Translation at the University of California, Irvine. He also publishes Mutiri, a Gikuyu literature and culture journal. In essence, I cannot describe the full scope of his work here, but as a Kenyan and a University of Oregon student, it honors me greatly to introduce to you novelist, playwright, essayist, and human rights activist, Mr. Ngugi wa Thiong'o.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was really a very special treat. And, I felt, it was very touching, the words and, oops. Oh, let me put it here. Like that. But that will restrict my movement. Okay, I'll try again. Yeah, I was saying that's very touching, and it took me back home to Kenya. And of course, I'm very proud that it was a Kenyan who introduced me to the audience tonight with such and so highly articulate. As I was told about her and the work she's doing in Kenya, I was looking forward to actually meeting her anyway, so that she can put me in touch with the Kenya I was not able to quite reach, because what she not actually say is that in the midst of that great welcome which my wife and I received from Kenyans, tremendous welcome after 22 years being away, we nevertheless were attacked on August 11 at midnight in one of the most secure parts of Nairobi. We were attacked by four armed people, and who really took us through torture, including raping my wife. So it's not, and yet it's a visit full of memories of both grandeur and also that aspect of Kenyan society. But it was very clear to us, that's my wife and I, that attack on us did not represent the spirit of Kenyan people. And we've been saying this over and over again. And in fact, when we returned to Irvine, we wrote a letter to all the faculty and students who were very concerned about our safety, to actually say that although it was an assassination attempt on us, but it did not really represent the spirit of Kenyan people, who were equally shocked, horrified, angry about the attack, and who continue sending letters of solidarity, particularly with my wife, who has, of course, become very outspoken about that attempt to, or rather that act of humiliation, but she refused to bow down to it, and so on. What I want to do tonight, and I must ask with an apology because I've just come from the airport. I don't know whether you are told about my saga. I was supposed to be here much earlier, but when we boarded our plane in Seattle, on our way here, it was diverted to Portland because there was something, I don't know what was wrong with it, because to me it felt fine in the but they said there's something wrong and I had to accept that, because it's for our safety. And so we have just been at Portland, sort of at the airport, doing nothing, But anyway, so my talk today, I hope it will be informal, and I really hope there will be some questions, because my talks are really built around, questions, so that way we can have interactions, and the discussion can move in any direction that is pertinent to some of the questions and some of the issues we may have in mind, And what I thought I would do is really talk in relation to myself, almost as if I were introducing myself, but these issues of memory and so on will come into play as I go along, because it's something which has been, particularly lately, has concerned me a great deal, the whole question of memory, and we'll see where it comes into tonight's, dialogue. And I was born in Kenya in 1938, in a country which was colonized by the British, So I was born into a British settler colony, There are two types of colonies in Africa, as you know. There's a protectorate type of colony for commercial, political exploitation, like Nigeria, Ghana, and so on, And also the settler type colony, where there was a sizable European settlement. One of the difference between a protectorate type colony and a settler type colony is the issue of land. Land becomes very basic in the settler type colony, like Kenya, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Angola, Algeria. But land is not so crucial in the struggles, say in Nigeria, especially in the anti-colonial process in Nigeria and Ghana. It's not that the land is not the basic issue. Another crucial difference between the settler type colony and the protectorate type is how, in fact, they acquired independence. In nearly all the settler type colonies, the colonization process involved armed struggle. Kenya is a good example, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, Algeria, They are all characterized by armed struggle in the decolonization process. And you don't find the same thing in a non-settler type, like Nigeria, Ghana, Uganda, and so on. So that although there was also political agitation and marching in the streets and so on, and organized, labor and peasantry and so on, but it did not translate into armed, armed struggle. When I started writing books, say in the 60s, just before or in the heyday of the anti-colonial process, in the 60s, a very important, the decade of the 50s to 60s was very, very important, for us, in Kenya, in Africa, and the world, In fact, it was the heyday of what I sometimes call the high noon of anti-imperialism in the world, if you look at the world at that time, after the Second World War, if you look at the map before the Second World War, the global map, it really is almost entirely colonial, except for Latin America, which disengaged itself from Europe in the 18th century, only to fall into a kind of neo-colonial relationship to its northern neighbor. But otherwise, before the Second World War, the world is really covered with colors that are French, British mainly. Yeah. But from about 1947, after the Second World War, India gets, just a couple of dates, for instance, India gets its independence in 1947, a very important event, given the fact that, in a way, India had been the longest, British colony, Remember, India is colonized at about the same time that the Europeans also colonized USA. Remember? Columbus this way, Vasco da Gama that way. Yeah. But 1947, India gets independence. In 1948, Chinese Revolution. China almost a semi-colony. In 1948, in Vietnam, the French had defeated in Dien Bien Phu. Malaysia, in the same 50s, there's insurrection against the British colonial rule there. There's of course the Korean War, which you know about. But it's part of that sort of energy which is coursing through the world in that period. You come across the same period to this part of the world. For instance, if you start from here, 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, Rosa Parks, bus boycott, 1954, or thereabout. The starts of not only the attack on, say, like the Brown versus Board of Education, really a victory against Jim Crow, so to speak, but really also part of, civil rights movement, that culminates in the 1964 Voting Rights Act here. You go to the Caribbean in the same period, labor movements in Jamaica, in Barbados, tremendous movement. And you come to Africa, armed struggle in Kenya in 1952, in Algeria at about the same period against the French, Ghana becoming independent in 1957. So between the 50s and the early 60s, country after country in Africa is actually acquiring education, independence, And I feel, I'm there. I was then in the second year at Makerere University College in Kampala. And I really feel strongly that the energy, the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, energy, that was everywhere, must have affected us as students also. Because how else do I explain the fact that I, as a colonial student, in my second year as an undergraduate student of English, felt that, I want to write books, and despite, I wanted to write books, and I felt I could write books, alongside my sort of other assignments, for my college work and so on, because it was extra. And I did, So by the time I came to write Weep Not Child in 1962, I'd already finished the manuscript, The River Between. And in all of them, I was trying to come into, to account, to in a way, face my history, our history. Particularly in the novel Weep Not Child, which is very much set in the period of my growing up, of my going to school, under what was then, there's Mau Mau armed struggle going on, and there's a British state of emergency where ordinary laws are more or less suspended, and the brutal suppression of the anti-colonial armed, struggle. And I'm trying to, when I read the novel Weep Not Child, I'm trying to understand that, process. The novel Weep Not Child deals with God of family who work on land for a British settler, but the land belonged to them. So here's a family which is actually working, whose labor is being used to work on the very land that actually belonged to them. And he, the god of family, have a very different, and the white settler have very different attitudes to the same land. They both claim the land for entirely different reasons. So the land issue and the body, the labor, becomes, very, very important. But there's another element which is very, very important, the issue of education. Education becomes an arena of struggle. Many Africans, as many of you will know, even today, the drive for education is still very, very strong. And you have to be in an African classroom, with sometimes, books sometimes are not often rare, but there's a compensation in the thirst, that you find, in people, the anxiety, the desire, the drive, to learn, that continues even today. But it's very, very strong when we were also, growing up. So the Gola family take their kid, Joroge, to school, very happy. He's happy, they are happy that he's going to school, And I want to share with you an English lesson, okay? What would happen is the teacher would put an African word on the blackboard, or an English word like stand up, and its equivalent in an African language. In my case, or in Joroge's case, Gikoyo. So in English, they used to learn, so I don't know whether they do it. I don't know whether you do it these days, those who study English in schools, or for those who teach English in schools. English language is very complicated, because everything has to agree, like gender, verbs and plurality and gender and all those things somehow to agree. And tense, and not all languages have the same structure. Like Kikuyu language, for instance, we don't have gender. When you say somebody has gone out, even in Kiswahili, you don't say, there's no gender. If you say, ametoka inje, you cannot tell by that sentence alone whether there's a man or a woman who has gone out. Ametoka inje, amekuja, he has come or she has come, In Kikuyu language, for instance, we do not say adjectives. We don't say blue sky. We say the sky which is blue. The adjective, the relation between adjective and noun plays differently. We shall come back to that. Anyway, so the teacher puts a word there, stand up, rogama, and of course he sings. I am standing up. What am I doing? And the class says, you are standing up. Again, you are standing up. Hey, good class. And I must tell you, class, that tomorrow, the white inspector is coming to the school. You are doing very well. Let's continue. Yeah. You, at the corner. Come on. What's your name? Come on, stand up, stand up. What's your name? Don't be shy. It's okay, it's okay. What's your name? Joroge? Oh, good, Joroge. Joroge stood up. Learning English was all right, but not when he stood up for all eyes to watch and maybe make faces at him. Joroge, what are you doing? Joroge, you are standing up. Joroge, I'm asking you, what are you doing? Joroge, you are standing up. No, not class. Come on, what are you doing? Njoroge was very confused. Hands were raised up all around him. He felt more and more foolish, so that in the end, he gave up the very attempt to answer. Class, what did I tell you? Inspection tomorrow, don't let me down. Okay. Here. Yeah. The girl, Moyaki, stand up. Good, Moyaki. Good. Show these boys what girls can do. Moyaki, what are you doing? Moyaki, a little bit scared. I am standing up. Oh, good. Now, Njoroge, what is she doing? Njoroge, I am standing up. The class giggled. The teacher is very annoyed now and is screaming, class, what is she doing? And the class now scared. You are standing up. I'm asking you, class, what is she doing? And the class, you are standing up. Look here, you stupid and lazy fools. How long do you take to catch things? Didn't we go over all this yesterday? If I come tomorrow and find that you make a single mistake, I'll punish you all very severely. Yeah. And she walks out. Now, that's just taste of learning English, And later, I published a novel in 1964, developed in 1965, the year I was graduating. Later I went to University of Leeds in England, and again, when studying there, I also wrote my novel, A Grain of Wheat, very different in the way it structures narrative and so on. I was much more interested in multiplicity of voices and so on. And later, along the same lines, I wrote another novel, Petals of Blood, which was published in 1977, I believe, 77. By then, I had returned to Kenya. I was a professor of literature at the University of Nairobi. I won't go into all the details, of that adventure. But some of us were also thinking at the same time that although we are professors at the University of Nairobi, we ought to go and work in the village. The accent was on taking culture to the village. And we thought that we would build this culture business, around the issue of theater and literacy program. And we chose a place called Kameredo, which is about 30 kilometers from Nairobi. Now, all this time, The River Between, With My Child, A Grain of Wheat, Petals of Blood were written in English, including 2 plays which I had done, one singly and the other one in collaboration. But in the village, the issue of language cropped up. What language were we going to use if we were going to work in the village, if we were going to connect with the people? So the issue of language confronted me for the first time in a real practical sense. I thought about it before, but it never came as a practical challenge, something which I had to confront. And that's how we came to write the play, develop the play which we called I'll Marry When I Want, Gahika Deda in Kikuyu language. In English translation, of course, I'll marry when I want. The reason why I chose the language, because there's no other way we were going to connect with the community without using the language they were then using. So it's purely a matter of practical necessity that actually we chose the language of that particular community. As it happened, it became so successful. People were coming from all over. And then November 16, 1977, the play was stopped by the Kenya government. And not only that, 3 weeks later, on the midnight of December 1977, that was December 1977, I was taken from my house at midnight by armed policemen and taken to a maximum security prison. Professor of literature the night before, a famous Kenyan writer, with 3 novels to his credit and plays and so on. And now I was in a maximum security prison without a name, no title, nothing, no trial even. I'm even more than that. I'm placed, the cell block where I was between 2 blocks. One for the mentally deranged, and the other block was for those who were facing death sentence, who were awaiting execution, So the writer, scholar, was placed between those 2 blocks, Now, one thing when you're in prison, or when you're in a hostile environment, one has to be very careful, at least this is why I reasoned, not to merge with the environment. If it's a grim environment, you must not merge with it, you must not become grim yourself. You must establish oppositional relationship between you and that environment. In other words, establish some kind of resistance, to that environment. And my way of resisting when I was there, we can go into this later during the question time, was really saying, how, as a writer, am I going to resist? I resist by writing in the very language which had been the base of my incarceration. But before I come to that, I started thinking very seriously about the issue of language. Why, I asked myself, had I been put in a maximum security prison for writing a play, working with the community, and more or less raising same kind of issues I had raised in my novels, and I had no problem. But when I raised the same issues in a language understood by the community, I'm put in a maximum security prison. That's how I started thinking about the language and its relationship to, and this is the process of my thinking. In all situations of the dominating and the dominated in a colonial situation, I found, or I came to the conclusion that Orana found that the dominating always imposed their language on the dominated. Again, why? I kept on asking myself. So this forced me to look again at the whole colonial project. And for me, I saw colonialism really basically as a process of alienation. As a process of alienation. Like the characters in my novel, Weep No Child, the land is taken away. But not only the land, but also the labor of the colonized is also taken away. Very crucial, 2 crucial resources, land and labor, are colonized. That which belonged to me, that which I had control over, I don't have control over it. Another has control over it. Okay? It's alienation, but in a manner that makes me look at myself and my resources, I can see my land and the product of my body being controlled by somebody else, But not only that, language itself. Language. What is language doing? Language, of course, is very crucial in the economic, political, and psychological evolution of any community. Language mediates the economic, political, psychological processes of any community. Without language, I doubt whether we would have even division of labor, which is the basis of human community. For instance, language becomes very, very important. But not just language. Language is also, very importantly, also the carrier of memory. Yeah. Again, without memory, we cannot negotiate our relationship with nature, our relationship with one another. We cannot even negotiate, our relation to our own bodies and our own minds. So why then does a colonial power have to impose their language on the colonized? Because in a way, if you get at the language of a people, in a way, you are getting at that which cements the whole economic, political, cultural, social, psychological, aspects of that community. Very, very important. And most crucial, you actually, in a way, also control the memory of that community. Very important. Language, indeed, is part of a vast naming system. You name, you own. Or rather, naming, you identify. Naming is a process of owning because it's only by naming that you identify, And if you identify, you are able to isolate the different elements in one's, environment. You remember, I don't know whether you know the novel, it's Robinson Crusoe. Where Robinson Crusoe, is shipwrecked on an island, and he discovered somebody called Friday. Okay, and it's assumed in their relationship that Friday has no language, and there comes a moment when Robinson Crusoe is teaching Friday language. So the first thing he does is the naming. Naming, he says, your name is Friday. Note, he does not ask Friday, what is your name? He said, no, your name is Friday. I name you. And my name is Master. Okay? So thereafter, whenever Friday presumably is asked by somebody, who is that man? Oh, he's Master. Okay? So note that it's Friday who names both. It's Crusoe who names Friday and also names himself, and by so doing establishes a certain relationship between them. Who Friday was? What really happening here? Friday is planting of Crusoe's memory on the body that now is called Friday. But presumably Friday had a name before. Okay? One, on the body of Friday is planted Crusoic memory. And if Crusoe is an English, what we are getting on the body of Friday is English memory. So his body, from then onwards, carries that memory. Whenever you see him, that is Friday. You don't say that is the person who was there before, whatever he was called. He is now Friday, the one who is named by I recently went to the year 2003. I was invited by Biko Foundation to give the fourth annual Biko lecture. And I went to, Biko was born in Eastern Cape, an area which has produced Mandela, Mbeki, many of the most important intellectuals in South Africa, and who had a very big impact on the rest of the continent in terms of in every field, where most of them were born in that area. So I'm traveling there, and the first town I come to is called Queenstown. Then there's another one called Kingstown in the same area. Then I go to another one, Williamstown or something, I come to a town called Berlin, Frankfurt, the street's name are the same. And I'm looking around to see a name that somehow or other that tells me about any of these giants of African thought who has come from that area. Nothing. The memory of place, the memory of what was, the memory of what had been produced, that memory is buried by another. Presumably that place had names, and not only that, it has produced all those other names, but those names, the memory of place buried under a European memory. Now, if you think of language then as a naming system, then you can see what actually Joroge is happening to Joroge. You can actually see what's happening to me as a writer. That I come to write, about Kenyan history, Mau Mau struggle, history of the people, if you like. That memory of the history, so crucial to their self-image, is written in English. Again, the memory that is struggle, the memory that is Mau Mau, the memory that is Kenya-wide struggle of African people in Kenya, I can only access it, if you like, through a European memory. Wherever Europe went, it planted its memory on the place and the body. We want to think of US. You go to, I was in New York University for 10 years before I came to California. And of course, the whole of that East Coast, we think of it as New England. Okay, New England. Presumably, that place must have names before. But we are talking about New York, New England, New Britain, New London, New Haven, New Jersey. Okay? That's literally planting of one memory over another. Okay? We can see it in terms of names of places, but language does functions also in the same way. So that we are in a situation today where I, as an African writer, or as an African scholar, as an African historian, writing about African history, but that history is only seen, or can only be seen, through English or French and so on. One memory is buried under another memory, When I was in that prison house, it's that whole, I tried to go against that. I made a decision that I would no longer write my fiction or poetry in English anymore. I was going to write in an African language, and I was going to write in the only language then I knew quite well, which was Kikuyu. I had to do this. I had to find a way of connecting myself to myself, and I had to go against that whole colonial assumption, that people can only know themselves via England, in this case, or via European languages, or via Europe. Because remember, it's not only at the level of languages, at the level of other things. To travel between me, Kenya, and Ethiopia, it's easier to go to London, get another plane back to Ethiopia. It's easier. Telephones will be the same thing. It was easier to telephone somebody in London who will connect you something else, before the era of mobile phones. It was easier to do that, the same thing. So, but I'm thinking of language. So, by actually the decision which I took, I was actually going against the whole colonial tenet, And I thought, and I still think, by so doing, I was trying to connect myself to my memory. And I was trying to also, in a sense, also call upon the entire African scholarship, the entire African literary establishment. Say, wait a minute. We have to connect ourselves to our memory. And connecting ourselves to memory is not the same thing as returning to a previous state of static being. Memory is not static. Memory is not static. We remember, we build on what we remember. So memory is also important for what we build. Memory is actually, you think of memory, it's not only do we remember that which has been, it's also memory which helps us project what is to come. Okay? So there's a way in which memory links the past, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Okay? And that's a memory which I think we as African writers should connect ourselves to. Not only really writers, but also scholars generally. I think, particularly African scholars, and even when you teach in English, like in this academy and other places, I think we should sensitize people that there are other languages, that the English language is not the only language. True, we cannot teach all languages in a class like here, but we can sensitize people that there are other languages. Let me give you an example of scholarship, what we do. I'm sure, I don't know whether all of us do, but all of us, whether we are historians, and culturalists, we go and do research in Africa. All of us do that, or other places. When we go there, we employ field workers, assistants to help us. You are an anthropologist or historian, you cannot speak the language, so naturally and correctly so, you employ an assistant who can speak the language and who takes, primary information from the community. In most cases, the informant will write those notes in English. The people are talking to him in whatever language, but he or she will take those notes in English. So those notes taken in English becomes now primary source. Becomes primary source, and when that work is published, the primary sources will be the field notes. In most cases, if actual field notes are taken in an African language, what the researcher gets, what is African or non-African, is the English translation of those notes. And the original notes in Africa are torn and burned. They don't exist. You burn that memory, and what's now in a European language becomes the primary source of that scholarship. And my own position is that things are upside down. We are continuing the colonial project in some ways, We are continuing the colonial project not because we are using English or French, but because we are replacing one memory by another, It's nothing to do with the fact we use English, There's nothing wrong with the English language or French, and so it's a language like any other, But there's something colonial about the way in Africa, post-colonial Africa, we have turned away from the primary languages for restoration of memory into other languages. This is what's wrong. It's not acquisition of English. It's not a question of French and so on. That's power. If you have your own language and you add more languages, that's power. But it's a colonial. When one says, I can only talk about myself. I can only know myself by traveling to Europe. If you want to look at Kenya, I must go to London, then look at myself. If I am to be whatever it is, I am only human when I become Friday, So I'm Friday and he is master, I cannot be myself when knowledge is real knowledge when it is coded in English. So the second thing I want to read is a small extract from the novel I wrote in prison on toilet paper in Gikuyu language. I wrote on toilet paper because, once again, you use what is around you. We didn't have paper. As in Tele, we are not allowed to have paper, no radio, no nothing, But there's one thing they gave us, which was toilet paper, So I said I would use the toilet paper they gave us, But the toilet paper you gave us had dual character. It was meant to punish us prisoners. So it's a bit hard. But what was hard was actually very good writing material. Yeah. So, and I told you about not being embedded with one's given environment. So I thought this time I'd use the satire as a way of looking at the post-colonial Kenyan society. And what I did in prison was I imagined a competition organized by the devil. Okay, the book is called Devil on the Cross, Shaitan Mudaravaine. And in this competition the competition is to choose the 7 cleverest thieves and robbers. But these are not all the robbers. They are robbers who, there's a one robber who comes and say, I want to take part in the competition. I am very good at pickpocketing market women. And he's to get out, You can only compete if you steal in billions. Okay? If you steal because you are hungry or you're not clothes, you are booted out. But if you steal because you have more than enough, that's what the kind of thief we really want. Furthermore, there's an observed delegation, the International Organization of Thieves and Robbers. They sent a delegation, and whose headquarters then, I don't know whether they've changed, but then when I was writing this, headquarters was New York. Yeah. But I believe it's a big delegation because I think there was Japanese there was a German there was a French, there was an English there. They were all part of the delegation. And the idea was to give the crown to the local robber who has done very well, and furthermore, who has a vision of how they would increase robbing the people. Now, the bit I want to read to you is actually the bit where one robber becomes so wealthy out of stealing from the people that he becomes a philosopher. he begins to wonder, what's all this about. So whenever I, Ditika Wangoji, contemplate my extraordinary wealth, I ask myself, sadly, several searching questions. You see, with all my property, what do I have as a human being that a worker or a peasant or a poor male does not have? You see, I have one mouth, just like the poor. I have one belly, just like the very poor. I have one heart, just like the very poor. And as a male, I have one, you know what I mean, just like the poorest of males. Indeed, my friends, I have enough money and property to supply food for 1,000 people, but I'm satisfied with one plateful, just like other people. I have enough money to wear 100 suits at a time, but I can only put on one pair of trousers, one shirt, one jacket, except in winter, of course, just like other people. I have enough money to buy 50 lives if lives were sold in the market. But I've only one heart and one life, just like other people. Indeed, my friends, I have enough property and money to enable me to make love to 10 women every night. But now one woman exhausts me after only one go, and I end up falling asleep without being completely satisfied. So see that I have only one mouth, one belly, one heart, one life, and one, you know what I mean. What's the difference between the rich male and the poor? What's the point of robbing others? And then one night, he reads about cloning and transplants and so on, and his aversion. It was revealed to me that night that in this country we should have a factory for manufacturing human parts like mouths, bellies, hearts, and so on, spare parts for the human body. This would mean that a rich man who could afford them could have 2 or 3 mouths, 2 or 5 bellies, 2 hearts, and as a male, 2, If the first mouth became tired of chewing and his belly could hold no more, then the spare mouth and belly would take over. And when an old man like me had a sugar girl, instead of falling asleep soon after the first engine had stalled, he would simply start up the other engine and continue the task in hand, the 2 engines supporting each other all night long, so that on waking up in the morning, he would feel that his heart and body were completely relaxed. But my fellow robbers, I made one mistake. I told my wife about it. Women have no secrets. You see, at first my wife was very pleased with the idea, and she hugged me and praised me in English, calling my clever little darling, and showered me with kisses. She said if the idea ever bore fruit, it would be wonderful, for it would be possible to distinguish the wife of a man of property from the wives of the poor. You see, these days, all women, be they rich or whatever, poor, look alike thanks to this mass production of clothes. But after the factory was built, the wives of the rich would be distinguished from those of the poor by their 2 mouths, 2 bellies, 2 or more hearts, and 2 or more of female, you know what I mean. When I heard her mention 2 female organs, and say that she would be able to have 2 instead of 1, I was simply horrified. I told her quite frankly that I would not mind her having 2 mouths or 2 bellies or multiples of any other organ of the body, but to have 2, no. I told her to forget all that nonsense. You know what? She started arguing with me and said if that was to be the case, then I wasn't going to be allowed to have 2. I asked her bitterly, why do you want to have 2? Tell me, what would you use 2 for? And she retorted, why do you want 2? What would you use 2 for? If you have 2, then I must have 2. We must have equality of the sexes. By this time, I was really very angry, and I told her to take her equalities to Oregon. Here we are Africans, and you must practice African culture. And as I threatened to beat her, she gave up. She surrendered. She could say, I could have 10, she would be satisfied with 1. So my fellow robbers, think about that. We male robbers could have 2 mouths, 2 bellies, 2 hearts, multiples of that, and hence several lives. Our money would buy us immortality. We would leave death to the poor. You, fellow robbers from New York, the crown has found its owner. Now, the book, when it came out in Kikuyu language, after it came out, was very well received by the people and so on, but of course, eventually, I was forced into exile. And I want to just to read the last bit from my book called Matigari, which was written when I was in exile. Again, in exile, I was faced with the same problems. I'm in an English language environment in London. How do I keep faith with my commitment, right, in an African language? Again, I did the same thing as I did in prison. I said the only way I can cope with this is the only way I can exist is actually by writing in Kikuyu language when I'm in London. Now, the novel Matigari, quite quickly, and actually also, this also shows that trying to recover one's memory has certain consequences, adverse consequences. The novel Matigari, written in Kikuyu 1986, tells of a person who has been fighting in the mountains for a house which he had built. And the house is taken by a white man, so they are fighting together in the mountains. But the moment he defeats the white person in the mountains, he comes home to reclaim his house. But he finds his house occupied by the sons and daughters of the very people he thought he had defeated in the mountains. By this time, he has taken off his belt of sort of gun in arms. He has put on a belt of peace. But he's struck by the irony of history. And it's this. He looks around and he sees that the people who produce are the ones who go without the benefits of what they have produced. He's a tiller, tills the land, he says, but he or she is not the one who controls the harvest. A tailor makes clothes, but he often goes without clothes himself. A builder builds a house, but he often lives in the veranda. So tell me. So he goes to students, to professors, to people with knowledge, to everybody. Tell me, where can a person find truth and justice in his land? And for that question, he is put in a mental asylum. Fortunately, or rather unfortunately, or whatever, depending on who is talking about it, he does escape along with other mad people in the same mental asylum. And in this fictional African country, everything stops because now the military, the police, have been us to get these crazy people. So the radio station, which is the only one in the country, called The Voice of Truth, is giving breaking news. Breaking news. This is another police announcement. The public are requested to report to the nearest police station anybody found speaking like a madman, or dressed in rags like a madman, or anyone with unkempt hair like a madman, or anybody seen asking awkward questions like a madman, or doing things which only a madman would do. The police are saying that all those who are not crazy must shave off their beards, cut short their hair, and keep it tidy at all times. They must not, repeat, must not wear rags. It so happened that when an elderly woman and her husband were rummaging through some dustbins, they were obviously a homeless pair, they came across posters bearing the pictures of Jesus Christ and Karl Marx. "Ah, here are those lunatics we have been hearing so much about," said the woman to her husband. And he agrees. "Yes, you are right, my dear. They have long hair and long beards, just like the lunatics," the man exclaimed. So, since as a reward, they each carried a poster and headed for the nearest police station. And the police are not amused by this. "Nyinyi wena wazimu, you are crazy yourselves. We want the actual madmen, not their photographs. Go and bring those madmen here, or better still, take us to where they are hiding." So the police go and look for Jesus Christ and Karl Marx in their hiding place. But they don't find them. So this back in the air, this is the voice of truth. This is an urgent announcement. The Minister for Truth and Justice has authorized the police to shoot down all mad people shoot on sight, including those two, if they are found. And then, after half an hour, the police have set up roadblocks in all the roads in their continuing effort to arrest escaped madmen. Many buses, are being searched, as it is believed that some of the madmen might have opted for public transport to escape. The police have asked the drivers of public transport to report anybody without bus fare or anybody seen hitching a lift. Now let me tell you, this country that we're talking about had tourism was very important. And just to describe, in the country, many of the tourists came from, probably there were even a few from Oregon, I understand. And some of them were, this thing you carry on your back, what do you call them? Backpacks? And others have you seen some people with jeans like mine, but they have patches on the knees here, torn. Some of them have bullet holes or something, And others have patches here or a torn here, and you can see through, not quite, but you can see the underwear and so on. And you may have seen others with hair with colored green and, like porcupines and so on. And of course, they are being harassed everywhere. First for asking for a lift with those packs and their long hair, and they are taken to police station, which of course alarms the American embassy and the British governments. They complain. So the voice of truth is back in the air. This is the voice of truth. The police have been told not to harass white people, even if they are wearing long beards and have unkempt hair, or even if they are dressed in rags and dirty clothes, or even if they are asking for lifts, or even if they are without bus fare. The police made this announcement after the United States and British governments complained through embassies here that their citizens are being harassed on the roads in the belief that they are madmen merely because of their beards and their long and kempt hair. The Minister for Truth and Justice apologized profusely, and he warned black people against racism. The public were warned against finding fault in people simply because of their white color. The chief of police has told the police, the public, members of the public, that in any case, white people never go mad. The police would like to inform the public that the escaped madmen, all of them, with the exception of a few Asians, are all black and African. What then happens to this novel is interesting, and I won't go into a story, but there was an attempt to arrest this character, Matigari, when news reached President Moi that there was a man called Matigari who was going around the country asking why he could find truth and justice, and Moi issued a warrant for his arrest so that he could be put in a maximum security prison, but they found he was a character in fiction, so they arrested the book instead. And indeed, that's true. By February, the book came out in 1986. In 1987, February, it was taken from all the bookshops from the shelf of all the bookshops in Kenya and from the publisher's warehouse. And there was a time, indeed, when Matigari existed only in English language, in exile, together with the author. What I'm trying to say basically is this, and I'll end on this note. The whole question of connection with the memory, with the place, is actually connecting with one's base. The way we apprehend reality all the time is by starting where we are. That's our base. And even when people fight, when people are fighting in a war, for instance, it's very interesting. They try to secure their base while destabilizing the opponent's base. Okay? Secure your base, destabilize the enemy's base anyway. We cannot, the cognitive process is a process of adding to what is around us. Okay? When I came here, like since we have been lost in Portland, maybe if I didn't know what I was going to do when I arrived here, because I didn't know whether anybody was going to meet me at that hour. But suppose I had called here and found any one of you and said, I'm Professor Ngugi, I'm lost, I don't know how to come to Oregon University. The first question you have to ask me is, where are you, Professor? But suppose I said, I have no idea where I am. You tell me, so okay, Professor, but look around you. See what you can find there. Suppose I said I cannot recognize anything around me. There's no way you would have been able to help me to get here. I would have to know where I was so I can find connection between where I was and this place. Okay? Very, very important, And so also is a question of memory, the question of place, the question of local knowledge, the question of our bodies, the question of our minds. That's our starting point towards connection with other people, And this memory is what I've been challenging African scholars in Kenya, like when I returned, in Kenya, in East Africa, in Africa, to connect ourselves to that memory. Not become prisoners of that memory, but connecting us to that memory as our starting point in our engagement with the world. And if you ask me today, what's the role of a scholar in a post-colonial Africa, particularly African scholars, I would say that's a very important challenge. It's a challenge which we have to take up at all costs. Thank you. there are questions there.
Thank you, Professor Ngugi. We have time for about 10 minutes worth of questions, and I ask you to, since the hour is late, please keep your questions brief and succinct. Yes, sir, in the blue.
Since you were in exile for over 2 decades, I'm wondering what your impressions were when you went back to Kenya, and what resonated most with you in terms of the kind of, what resonated in terms of what was home and what wasn't that you could identify with that most relevant?
A number of things. First of all, when I arrived in Kenya after 22 years, Nairobi, actually we went through via South Africa and then arrived in Nairobi. And our whole, I gave a press conference at the airport to say that I really want to be in touch with the everyday. Because as a writer, this is what you miss most. You miss the everyday. But the everyday, I mean, is what people do in the marketplace, in the shopping arena, how they dress in the street, how they walk, how they talk. So many little things that you really want to connect. But unfortunately, really, I was not able to do that, first because of the welcome which I received, which is tremendous, which my wife and I received, and the attack in the midst of that tour. Because we arrived there on July 31st, say August 1st, and by August 11, we were confronting 4 people armed with guns and machete and wire cutters in the middle of the night, my wife and I, and we had to fight our way, out of that apartment, escaped narrowly death, which was what was, I think, we were meant to suffer. So I didn't really get in touch with that which, I want to get in touch with, But there are some very obvious things that, obviously one could see. One, obviously, is what I had seen before I left Kenya, but it was very, very pronounced. And this is the gap between. In Nairobi, you found the houses with palatial houses, tremendous, house, new estates, wonderful, But beside them also, slums, What I found is a gap between the very wealthy and the very poor was actually widening. It widened at a very alarming rate. This was almost alarming. And for me, it was alarming because this is not, for me, this actually reflected also the world as I see it, the globalized world as I see it. Because when I look at the world quite quickly, I see it, the gap between the few rich nations, say around the G8, and that of the rest of the world, the gap is widening, not closing, okay? Widening, But I also look at the within nations, and I see the same gap, whether it's here or or Nairobi or South Africa. So between nations, the wealth of a few nations and the poverty of majority of nations, that gap is widening. But also within nations, the same gap. For instance, here in this country, you'd assume that with all the wealth that there is in this country, we don't have homeless people in California or, say, or New York. You'd think that this general would mean more hospital beds, more hospital places, better schools all around, and yet this is not really the case. And yet there is wealth. Okay, so what I found in Nairobi, for me, became, in fact, a mirror image of what is happening in a globalizing or a globalized or globalizing world, where the gap between the have nations and the have not nations is widening, and within the nations themselves, big or small, the gap between the have social strata and the have not social strata, that gap is widening.
Also, in lots of your novels, you talk about armed struggle, and here you really talked about memory. So I was just curious that how will you talk about the relationship between memory and armed struggle, or how memory actually becomes important in a class struggle or armed struggle in the context of the colony?
Of course, in the colonies, as I said, armed struggles, it's happened that historically that where there was the land question was often resolved, or it's armed struggle was part of that decolonization process, but really, underlying everything, memory is crucial, because even when people are fighting, what underlies the decolonization process, the drive towards decolonization, is really an attempt to connect with one's memory of place, memory of one's place, memory of one's body, memory of one's mind, Because as I said, memory, even in a human community becomes, we can't think of education really without memory, because it connects tomorrow, today, and yesterday, We remember the past, but we also project the future, The skills we get out of our connection with our environment is stored in our memory and so on, So when that is pruned or when it is connected, it disturbs all the other, processes. So I'd put the question of memory as being primary. The other things, armed struggle is not a name, obviously. I mean, it cannot be a name. It just happens that there are cases where this has happened, but you don't say, oh, this society, we must armed struggle, but struggle underlies all our being anyway. Struggle, In fact, I would say that there are two important struggles in human society. Struggle with nature and struggle among humans. Those basic struggles underlie every society. Struggle with nature and struggle with other humans. Struggle with nature because we eke our living from nature, from our environment. Hopefully, it should be a matter of a struggle of give and take. Although in a way we have been developing nature and so on, we've been developing as if we are masters of nature. That. I think it's probably my wife calling. I'll call her later. She's wondering where I am. Yeah. Struggle with nature. Sometimes we think we are masters of nature, but occasionally nature, through volcanoes, flooding, fires, tsunamis, reminds us we are not masters of nature, that we have, in fact, to learn, again, sometimes from our past. Nature, give and take, balance relation with nature, not distorted relationship with nature. Because from nature we can get everything, but it should be balanced relationship with nature. Let me just give you one example of how crucial nature is to our being. Of course, we know it, but let me just give a practical illustration. I may think my arm is more me than the air I breathe, for instance, because, But if you cut my arm, but please don't do it, okay? I can live for a day, for a month, for a year, probably for the rest of my life. But if you switch off the air I breathe, I'll not last a day. So there's a way in which the air, although it's external to me, is a more integral part of my being than than even my arm. So there's a way in which the person who is polluting the air I breathe through factories or environmental actually is a criminal behavior because actually threatening my life directly. So if you can get angry, if somebody came and whacked over your arm, we should have the same kind of anger, at the pollution of the environment, because that is interfering with Anyway, there's that struggle, that struggle with nature, but also there's a struggle with other human beings, also, for the control of that entire relationship. So struggle is what makes us. Struggle is me, is you. Struggle is our history, so to speak, and it's very important.
Over here.
Professor Ngugi, I read some of your books in Tanzania when I was doing literature, and loved them. But the problem is, you were talking about colonialization, and I was reading them in 81, when at that time we were going to get independence, etc. So I did not have that memory of the drive or energy that was accompanying during that time. And unfortunately, that energy continues to die today. We look at the civil rights movement in this country. That energy and the drive is dying in some way, but we still have the same issues, kind of hidden or manifested in a different way. The colonization continues today in a different way. How do we, my sons unfortunately cannot even speak Swahili, so I cannot tell them in Swahili. So how do we continue to have this memory of the drive? How do we do this?
And again, in my view, and I agree with you, there is a tendency to, especially with globalization, is really, sometimes we can develop despair sometimes, but sometimes hope sometimes lies in the very conditions under which we live. If you ask me really, I would say about global stability and even national stabilities. What is threatening those stabilities and world peace today is not even weapons of mass destruction, which again are hoarded by the G8 countries, who among themselves can blow the world over and over again, and I wish the G8 countries can say, let's get rid of weapons of mass destruction, which we hold, because we can blow the world, But anyway, what threatens the peace, stability in the world, actually is those gaps which I talked about, the increasing gap between a few rich nations and a majority of countries which are increasingly poor. And of course the gap, the same rift between the social haves and the majority of social have-nots, And I think we have somehow to rediscover in ourselves, that memory, in fact, of struggle, because without it, in a sense, we have no future as a human community. Because if this gap goes on increasing, there's no doubt that it's undercuts, our human stability. But fortunately, things don't always go that way. In other words, even with globalization, which we see today in terms of the freedom of capital to go across the nation states and barriers and so on, going to Kenya and out and so on, there's also through technology, information technology, also it means that also the working people say in America, the working people say in Kenya, in other places, also are aware of what, people are also aware of what's happening in other parts of the world, So there's one trend, which is globalization, but I think there's another trend also, which is globalism. If I might make, if there's a distinction between globalization and globalism, the sense that we can, in fact, make, a human community, but that community can only be made by us, through struggle. In other words, we really have no alternative but to rediscover those memories, of struggle. And struggle does not always mean armed struggle, by the way. It's struggle in every way. Struggle. Even struggle, even ideas. The struggle of our images. For instance, is a struggle. For instance, the struggle of ideas is a struggle. The struggle as to whether we call Africans tribes is important in the self-conception of those people and so on. Tribes meaning a collection of people with maybe kinship, but without stabilities of language, of territory, of economy, and so on. So it's in Nigerians, Yorubas, who are 30 million people, can be called a tribe. And Norwegians, who are only 4 million people, are a nation. Yeah? And even we call ourselves tribe. You ask me, I'm a Kiku tribesman. What's a Kiku tribesman, Yeah. So, those kind of even self-conceptions, how people conceive themselves, how people describe themselves, how they are described, even that is a very important, element of struggle. How we conceive ourselves as a human community, whether indeed we are meant to feel despondent. There's nothing we can do about our environment is important, or whether we feel, yes, we can do something about our environment is also important. But unfortunately, the kind of colonial education we used to get, and I'm sure it's probably education in general, it tends to mystify my base, who's around us. We tend to know more about that is farthest removed from ourselves, and very little about what's around us. And as I said, for me, knowledge, if I'm in Oregon, I should know Oregon. That's my starting point, what connect Oregon to other places, to the world, to China. I can see the connection between the two. Yeah.
Well, in conclusion, let me risk planting a few memories. First, the conversation will continue. Professor Ngugi will be interviewed on UO today, which will be broadcast in the coming weeks, and I hope you'll be able to tune in. Second, let me take a moment to offer 3 sets of thanks. First, thanks to the co-sponsors of tonight's event, the International Studies Program, the Savage Endowment for International Peace, and the Oregon Humanities Center. Second, thanks to you, the audience, for your patience with a delayed start and for your engagement with, I think, a really wonderful and rich talk. And finally, please join me in thanking Professor Ngugi for joining us tonight.